There is a peculiar comfort in believing that wealth behaves loudly, that it announces itself through headlines, that it reveals its intentions through trends, that those who possess it are simply more visible, more confident, more willing to display it. This belief is reassuring. It suggests that nothing truly important happens beyond public view. That power is obvious, that value is transparent. That if one simply pays attention, one will not be left behind. But history tells a different story. The most consequential shifts in wealth have never been theatrical. They occur quietly, patiently, often in ways that appear unremarkable at the time. And by the time they are recognized, they are already complete. We are living through such a moment now. Not a crisis in the conventional sense, not a collapse, not an ending, but a reorientation. A subtle movement away from abstraction and towards permanence. And those who sense it earliest are not speculators, nor visionaries, nor revolutionaries. They are custodians. People whose primary concern is not growth, but continuity. Before we go any further, consider this carefully. Every major financial conversation of recent years has been dominated by spectacle, digital currencies, equity valuations, property cycles, technological disruption. Each promises transformation. Each claims inevitability. And yet beneath this noise, a quieter logic is asserting itself. Those with the longest perspective are withdrawing attention and capital from assets that depend upon belief, and they are reallocating it toward things that endure regardless of sentiment. This is not retreat. It is recalibration. To understand why this matters, we must abandon the modern obsession with speed. Speed distorts judgment. It rewards reaction over reflection. It encourages the assumption that value is something that appears suddenly, rather than something that accumulates slowly. But real wealth has never behaved this way. It has always favored patience, and patience in turn favors the essential. Let us begin with something deceptively simple. Land, not property portfolios, not speculative development, not urban appreciation narratives. Land itself. For centuries, land has formed the quiet foundation of influence. Empires expanded to secure it. States taxed it to survive. Families preserved it across generations. In more recent times, land fell from intellectual fashion. Industrialization shifted focus toward machinery. Finance elevated liquidity. Digitalization encouraged abstraction. Land came to be seen as old-fashioned, inflexible, almost inconvenient. And yet, those who truly understand systems never abandoned it. They simply refined their criteria. Not all land matters equally. The land being accumulated today is not chosen for aesthetics or prestige. It is chosen for function, soil quality, access to water, climate resilience, proximity to infrastructure. These characteristics are not romantic. They are structural. Historically, societies that retained control over food production retained autonomy. Those that outsourced it became dependent. This pattern predates modern economics. When grain routes failed, cities starved. When harvests collapsed, currencies followed. The lesson was never forgotten by those who read history carefully. Modern agriculture may appear industrial, mechanized, predictable, but it rests on fragile assumptions: stable weather, reliable water, global logistics. Each of these assumptions is now under strain, not catastrophically, incrementally. An incremental pressure is far more dangerous than sudden shock. It normalizes adjustment, it encourages complacency. This is why land suited for production is being accumulated quietly, not for short-term yield, but for strategic permanence. Ownership of such land is not about profit margins. It is about remaining relevant in systems where relevance becomes scarce. But land alone does not sustain life, which brings us inevitably to water. Water has always occupied a peculiar position in human civilization. It is universally required, yet unevenly distributed, essential, yet often taken for granted. Historically, control over water preceded control over territory. Rivers defined borders. Canals determined trade. Reservoirs dictated survival. In the modern era, water receded into the background. It was treated as a utility, a service, a technical concern. But law remembers what culture forgets. In many regions, access to water is governed by ancient rights, established long before modern populations, modern cities, or modern demand. These rights do not adjust to fairness. They adhere to precedents, and precedence is indifferent to circumstance. As pressure increases, through population growth, environmental volatility, and infrastructure strain, these rights transform quietly into instruments of power. Not through force, through enforceability. Cities adapt, agriculture contracts, industry negotiates, and those who hold access do not need to advertise it. Scarcity speaks for itself. This is not a story of exploitation. It is a story of foresight. Those who understood the structure early positioned themselves accordingly. The third category of accumulation appears, at first glance, entirely unrelated. It does not involve land. It does not involve resources. It involves risk. But not the type of risk most people imagine. Modern finance assumes that risk can be diversified, spread across assets, hedged through correlation. This assumption worked when systems were loosely connected. It fails when they become tightly coupled. In tightly coupled systems, stress propagates. Markets move together. Liquidity evaporates simultaneously. Diversification collapses precisely when it is needed most. There exists, however, a category of risk that remains stubbornly indifferent to financial cycles. Physical risk, storms, seismic activity, environmental disruption. These events are indifferent to monetary policy. They do not respond to sentiment. They are uncorrelated with optimism. Financial instruments linked to such risks occupy a peculiar space. They are neither speculative nor defensive. They are independent, and independence, in mature systems, becomes invaluable. This is why such instruments have found favor among institutions tasked not with growth, but with preservation. They are not exciting. They are reliable, and reliability is rare. Now consider what unites these seemingly disparate assets. Land suited for production. Control over water. Exposure to physical rather than financial risk. None of these depend on narratives. None require belief. None derive value from participation. They simply function. And function, when complexity rises, becomes the highest form of value. This is the shift most people miss. They assume the wealthy are searching for the next breakthrough. In reality, they are preparing for disappointment, not collapse. Adjustment. A future that delivers less than promised, rather than nothing at all. In such futures, essentials outperform abstractions. Not because they grow faster, but because everything else weakens. Relative stability becomes absolute advantage. This is not fear-driven behavior. It is historically literate behavior. And history is unforgiving toward those who ignore it. If this feels unfamiliar, that is intentional. The most important ideas rarely feel familiar at first. In the next part, we will examine why this reorientation is happening now, not earlier, not later, and what signals in past transitions suggest about the phase we are entering. To understand why this quiet reallocation is taking place now, rather than in some distant future or forgotten past, one must resist the temptation to think in years. Years are deceptive. They encourage the illusion that change is sudden, that eras end decisively, that transitions announce themselves with clarity. History does not move that way. It moves through phases, and the most consequential phase is always the one in which a system appears most refined. This is the stage we now inhabit. Complexity has reached a level where it masquerades as stability. Financial instruments multiply. Policies grow increasingly sophisticated. Interventions become more precise, more technical, more frequent. To the casual observer, this looks like progress. To the historically attentive, it looks like saturation. Because complexity does not resolve contradictions. It conceals them. Every long-lived economic order follows a similar rhythm. First, there is expansion, productive, optimistic, grounded in tangible output. Then comes abstraction. Credit deepens, leverage accelerates, returns appear detached from effort. Finally, there is dependence on confidence, on coordination, on the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to postpone reckoning. This final stage is not dramatic. It is administrative. And that is what makes it dangerous. When systems rely increasingly on management rather than margin, they become exquisitely sensitive to disturbance, not collapse. Disturbance. This is why those with the greatest exposure begin to reduce fragility long before the public senses danger. Not because they expect catastrophe, but because they understand fragility. Consider the historical relationship between wealth and land. In earlier centuries, land ownership was overtly linked to power. It determined who ate, who ruled, who endured. With industrialization, this connection appeared to weaken. Factories mattered more than fields. Capital mattered more than acreage. And for a time, this was true. But what changed was not the importance of land, only its visibility. Those who retained land did so quietly, not out of nostalgia, but out of understanding. Because land is not merely a productive asset, it is a constraint on systems. It limits dependence. It anchors autonomy. As economies grew increasingly global, supply chains extended, efficiency improved, costs fell, and vulnerability increased. When production depends on uninterrupted logistics, stable geopolitics, and predictable climate, resilience becomes conditional. Conditional resilience is not resilience at all. It is optimism disguised as planning. This is why productive land capable of yielding sustenance under variable conditions, has regained strategic significance, not as a commodity, as a fallback. History is replete with examples. When trade routes faltered, those who produced locally endured. When currencies devalued, those who held productive assets adapted. When institutions failed, those with access to essentials negotiated from strength. These patterns are not romantic. They are empirical, and they reassert themselves whenever systems stretch beyond their margins. The same logic applies to water, though its implications are even more subtle. Water is rarely discussed in polite financial discourse. It lacks glamour. It resists abstraction. And yet, no civilization has survived without securing it. What distinguishes the modern era is not scarcity itself, but the legal architecture surrounding access. Rights established centuries ago continue to dictate present outcomes. These rights do not respond to population density. They do not adjust to urban growth. They do not renegotiate themselves according to fairness. They persist. And persistence, in times of strain, becomes authority. As environmental variability increases, access becomes leverage, not because anyone intends harm, but because systems respond to pressure through hierarchy. Those closest to resources adapt. Those further away negotiate. Those without access adjust expectations. This is not cruelty. It is structure. Those who recognized this early did not need to act dramatically. They simply positioned themselves within the architecture. The same principle underlies the third category of accumulation: exposure to physical rather than systemic risk. Modern finance is deeply interconnected. Markets respond to one another reflexively. A disturbance in one domain ripples outward, amplified by leverage and synchronized behavior. Diversification, once a safeguard, becomes ceremonial. In moments of stress, correlations converge. This is when theoretical resilience reveals itself as fragile. Physical risk behaves differently. It does not cascade through sentiment. It does not correlate with policy. It does not respond to narratives. It occurs independently. This independence is precisely what makes it valuable. Financial instruments linked to such risks are not expressions of pessimism. They are acknowledgments of reality. Reality does not optimize. It persists. Institutions tasked with preserving capital rather than multiplying it understand this distinction well. They are not attempting to escape risk. They are choosing which risks to bear. And this choice reveals more about their expectations than any public statement ever could. Now, step back and observe the pattern forming. Land that produces essentials. Control over water. Exposure to uncorrelated risk. None of these choices signal excitement. They signal restraint. And restraint is not fashionable. It does not perform well on screens. It does not reward impatience, which is why it is so often misunderstood. The public interprets restraint as fear. In reality, it is confidence without exhibition. Confidence that does not require validation. Confidence rooted in structure rather than sentiment. This distinction becomes increasingly important as systems mature. Late-stage systems reward participation. They penalize hesitation. They encourage individuals to remain engaged, consuming, investing, reacting. Those who disengage quietly are often mistaken for being behind. In truth, they are stepping aside, not out of disengagement, out of perspective. They recognize that when systems approach limits, value migrates toward what cannot be substituted. Food cannot be substituted. Water cannot be substituted. Independence cannot be substituted. Everything else is negotiable. This is why the reallocation we are observing feels almost invisible. It does not rely on spectacle. It does not require persuasion. It unfolds through private transactions, long-term leases, legal claims, and institutional mandates. It does not ask to be noticed, and that is precisely its strength. Now consider the psychological implications. Most people experience the current moment as confusing. Signals contradict one another. Markets rise while confidence falls. Innovation accelerates while security erodes. This dissonance creates anxiety. Anxiety demands resolution, and resolution is often sought in narratives. Grand explanations, simplified enemies, promised breakthroughs. But narratives are not solutions. They are coping mechanisms. Those who resist the comfort of narrative must find stability elsewhere. They find it in structure, in history, in patterns that repeat not because humans are foolish, but because systems impose similar constraints across time. The reorientation we are witnessing is not pessimistic. It is conservative in the truest sense of the word. Not politically, structurally. It seeks to conserve relevance, to preserve optionality, to remain standing when conditions tighten. This is why the present moment matters. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is decisive. Decisive in the sense that positions taken now will define who adapts smoothly and who adjusts painfully later. In the next part, we will turn inward, away from systems and capital flows, toward the individual navigating this environment. What clarity looks like when noise is constant, what intelligence looks like when certainty is unavailable, and why understanding these dynamics is less about wealth and more about dignity. At a certain point, discussion of systems becomes incomplete without acknowledging the individual living within them. Not as a participant in markets, not as a consumer of narratives, but as a conscious observer attempting to maintain coherence in an environment designed for distraction. This is where the conversation deepens. Because the most significant effect of late-stage systems is not economic. It is psychological. When structures grow vast and opaque, responsibility becomes abstract. Cause and effect blur. Individuals are encouraged to believe they are free, while quietly adapting their behavior to constraints they did not design and cannot influence. This is not oppression. It is conditioning. And conditioning is far more effective when it feels voluntary. Consider how modern economic life presents itself. Opportunity appears abundant. Choice seems endless. Mobility is promised, if not delivered. Yet beneath this surface lies a subtle compression. Time horizons shorten. Risk tolerance narrows. Decisions become reactive rather than reflective. People feel busier, but less decisive. In such environments, intelligence is not measured by understanding. It is measured by compliance. Those who question structures are labeled pessimistic. Those who disengage are dismissed as unrealistic. Those who pause are overtaken. And so participation becomes compulsory, not through force, but through design. This is the psychological terrain in which late-stage systems thrive. They do not require belief, they require attention. And attention, once captured, is directed. The constant movement of markets, information, and opinion creates the illusion of agency. One feels involved, one feels informed, one feels responsible. Yet responsibility without influence is not empowerment. It is burden. This is why the most quietly powerful individuals cultivate distance. Not disengagement, distance. They observe without reacting. They act without announcing. They resist the pressure to explain themselves to the present moment. This is not arrogance. It is discipline. Historically, those who endured periods of transition shared a common trait. They refused to confuse activity with progress. During times of instability, the loudest participants rarely emerged strongest. It was those who preserved clarity. Clarity allowed them to see when systems were signaling stress rather than opportunity. Clarity allowed them to distinguish between volatility and deterioration. Clarity allowed them to wait. Waiting in modern culture is treated as failure, but waiting has always been a strategic act. It requires confidence that one is not missing something essential And confidence of that kind is rooted not in optimism, but in understanding. Now consider how this relates to the assets discussed earlier. Land does not demand attention. Water rights do not fluctuate daily. Physical risk instruments do not provoke speculation. They sit quietly. Their value does not need reinforcement through narrative. This quietness mirrors the psychological posture of those who hold them. They are not attempting to outrun change. They are positioning themselves to absorb it. This posture stands in stark contrast to the dominant cultural impulse, the impulse to react immediately, to interpret constantly, to seek reassurance through participation. Late-stage systems amplify this impulse because it stabilizes them. A reactive population is predictable. Predictability enables management. Management postpones adjustment, but postponement does not eliminate consequence. It accumulates it, which is why clarity becomes a form of insulation, not insulation from events, but from misinterpretation. Those who understand the structure do not panic when volatility increases. They recognize volatility as pressure escaping. They do not assume rising complexity means increasing control. They recognize complexity as a symptom of constraint. This perspective changes one's internal experience profoundly. Anxiety decreases. Urgency fades. The need to constantly optimize gives way to a quieter objective. Maintain coherence. Coherence is underrated. It allows decisions to align with values rather than incentives. It allows individuals to preserve dignity in environments that reward conformity. It allows one to resist being emotionally conscripted by narratives designed to mobilize rather than inform. Now let us be precise. This is not an argument for withdrawal. Withdrawal creates vulnerability. Isolation erodes relevance. The aim is not detachment. It is selective engagement, to know when participation adds value and when it merely sustains momentum. To recognize when opportunity is real and when it is manufactured to preserve belief. This discernment cannot be taught quickly. It emerges from pattern recognition, from historical literacy, from the willingness to accept that no system is permanent, and that permanence is not the goal. The goal is continuity with integrity. This is where many misunderstand the wealthy. They assume the pursuit is dominance. In truth, it is continuity, the ability to remain unforced, to avoid being compelled into decisions by external pressure, to retain the freedom to choose one's response. Freedom of that kind is rare, and it is rarely discussed openly, because it does not perform well. It cannot be marketed easily. It does not promise transformation. It promises steadiness. Now consider the broader implication. As systems mature, they increasingly reward scale over sensitivity. Large institutions absorb shocks. Individuals experience them. This creates a widening psychological gap. Institutions speak of stability. Individuals feel fragility. This dissonance is deeply unsettling. It leads people to doubt their own perception, to assume that discomfort indicates misunderstanding rather than insight. But discomfort in such moments is often a signal of awareness. Awareness that expectations no longer align with structure. Awareness that inherited assumptions require revision. Those who ignore this awareness seek relief through certainty. Those who honor it seek clarity. Clarity does not offer comfort. It offers orientation, and orientation is sufficient. Because when direction is understood, speed becomes secondary. The present moment does not require dramatic action. It requires intellectual honesty. Honesty about what systems can deliver. Honesty about what they cannot. Honesty about the difference between promise and probability. Those who possess this honesty do not rush. They do not chase. They do not demand reassurance. They prepare quietly, not for disaster, for adjustment. Because adjustment is the natural state of all enduring systems. In the final part, we will bring this reflection to its natural conclusion, not by offering prescriptions, not by issuing warnings, but by articulating what it means to live well, intellectually and emotionally, inside a system that is changing without asking permission. And why, in such times, thoughtfulness itself becomes a form of capital. Every serious inquiry must eventually arrive at a point of stillness, not because all questions have been answered, but because the right questions have finally been asked. What we have examined is not a prediction of collapse, nor a manifesto for resistance. It is an observation of transition, a recognition that systems, like individuals, evolve not through intention, but through pressure. And pressure reveals structure. The modern economic order has delivered extraordinary achievements. Material comfort, technological acceleration, global coordination on an unprecedented scale. It would be dishonest to deny this, but it would be equally dishonest to ignore the cost. Complexity has replaced simplicity. Abstraction has replaced tangibility. Expectation has replaced margin. And when expectation becomes the primary stabilizing force, fragility is never far behind. This is not failure. It is maturity. Mature systems cease to expand effortlessly. They begin to manage themselves. They rely on maintenance rather than momentum. They prioritize continuity over imagination. In such systems, those who thrive are rarely those who move fastest. They are those who move least under pressure. This is the quiet lesson embedded in the behavior we have explored: the accumulation of land that produces essentials, the securing of access to water rather than promises of supply, the acceptance of physical risk over systemic illusion. These are not defensive gestures. They are acknowledgments. Acknowledgments that no structure remains optimal forever. That resilience does not arise from prediction. It arises from positioning that does not require certainty, only humility. Humility before history. History reminds us that every era believes itself exceptional. Every generation assumes its challenges are unprecedented, and yet, when viewed from distance, patterns reassert themselves, not mechanically, humanly. We build systems to serve us. Over time, we serve the systems we have built. Eventually, adjustment becomes unavoidable. This is the moment we now inhabit. Adjustment does not announce itself loudly. It unfolds through small constraints, through revised expectations, through the gradual recalibration of what feels normal. Most people will experience this not as crisis, but as pressure. The sense that effort yields less, that stability feels conditional, that certainty is increasingly manufactured. In response, many will seek reassurance. They will gravitate toward confident voices. Clear answers, bold predictions. But confidence is not clarity, and clarity, though quieter, is far more durable. Those who cultivate clarity do not need to reject the system. They need only to see it accurately, to recognize where incentives distort behavior, to understand where narratives obscure structure, to accept that participation does not require belief, only awareness. This awareness changes how one relates to the world. One stops expecting institutions to provide meaning. One stops confusing access with security. One stops mistaking complexity for intelligence. Instead, one seeks coherence between thought and action, between expectation and reality, between personal values and systemic incentives. This coherence is not dramatic. It does not draw attention, but it confers something increasingly rare: composure. Composure in the face of volatility. Composure in the absence of guarantees. Composure when others demand urgency. Composure allows one to act deliberately, and deliberation in mature systems becomes a form of advantage. This is why the most valuable asset we have not discussed is internal. It is the capacity to think independently under pressure, to remain intellectually sovereign when narratives compete for allegiance, to choose when to engage and when to remain still. Such capacity cannot be purchased. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be accelerated. It is cultivated, and cultivation takes time. If there is one conclusion worth carrying forward, it is this: the future will not belong to those who predicted it most loudly, nor to those who chased it most aggressively. It will belong to those who remained clear while it unfolded, clear enough to adapt without panic, clear enough to preserve dignity under constraint, clear enough to recognize that not all value announces itself, and that silence often precedes significance. If you have remained with this reflection until its end, that itself suggests a disposition increasingly at odds with the prevailing tempo. A willingness to listen beyond the surface, to consider before reacting, to value understanding over reassurance. That disposition matters, because thoughtful attention is quietly becoming one of the scarcest resources of all. If this perspective has offered you clarity, not certainty, but orientation, then it may be worth continuing the conversation, not as affirmation, but as exploration. A considered subscription is not an act of agreement. It is an acknowledgement that depth still deserves space. A reflective comment, one that adds thought rather than noise, contributes more than volume ever could. And if there is someone whose mind you trust, whose conversation you value, whose questions sharpen rather than simplify, this is precisely the kind of material worth sharing with them. Not to persuade, but to think together. Because in an age that rewards immediacy, the decision to think slowly is no small thing. And in systems that thrive on distraction, clarity remains a quiet form of independence.